II, especially from the early 1950s, the United States entered the height of an extreme anti-communist wave, viewing communism as a direct threat to national security and social order. In the context of the emerging Cold War, the U.S. government gradually constructed an ideological confrontation mindset that shaped its perceptions of national liberation movements worldwide. However, before relations deteriorated, the United States and the Vietnamese revolutionary movement experienced a period of limited cooperation. During the years 1943 to 1945, in the struggle against Japanese fascism in Indochina, President Ho Chi Minh proactively established contact with the United States by rescuing downed American pilots and providing intelligence information. In return, U.S. intelligence agencies supported the Viet Minh with medical aid, weapons, communications equipment, and limited military training. Nevertheless, after the establishment of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the United States increasingly regarded the new government as a proxy of international communism, causing bilateral relations to shift rapidly from cooperation to confrontation. Contrary to the initial expectations of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the United States did not choose to support Vietnam's nascent independence after World War II. Prior to 1950, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam had not yet received official recognition or assistance from the Soviet Union or China, indicating that it was not fully integrated into the International Socialist Alliance system. In this context, President Ho Chi Minh repeatedly sought support from the United States, viewing it as a potential force capable of safeguarding Vietnam's right to self-determination against the threat of renewed French colonial aggression. Notably, several letters were sent to President Harry S. Truman in 1945 and 1946, in which Ho Chi Minh appealed for U.S. intervention in support of Vietnam's independence and territorial integrity. However, these appeals received no official response from Washington. Instead, as Cold War thinking intensified, the United States gradually shifted its stance from indifference to obstruction and isolation of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam on the international stage. This choice contributed to pushing Vietnam into prolonged confrontation with Western powers and laid the groundwork for deep conflicts in the subsequent period of modern history. As the Cold War grew increasingly intense, major developments in Asia significantly heightened U.S. strategic anxieties. The founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949, followed by the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950, led U.S. policymakers to believe that communism was expanding rapidly and posed a threat to dominate the entire Asia-Pacific region. In this context, the U.S. government increasingly viewed national liberation movements with socialist orientations not merely as internal affairs of individual countries, but as components of a global confrontation between two opposing blocs. On this basis, President Dwight D. Eisenhower articulated the domino theory, which posited that if one country fell to communism, neighboring countries would collapse in a chain reaction. Within this logic, Vietnam occupied a particularly crucial position, being regarded as the strategic gateway to Southeast Asia. If Vietnam were lost, from the American perspective, the entire region, from Laos and Cambodia to Thailand and beyond, could fall outside Western influence. This perception transformed Vietnam into a strategic hotspot in U.S. global policy. Guided by Cold War logic and the domino theory, the United States gradually deepened its involvement in Indochina by supporting French colonial forces in their war against the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Washington's primary objective was to prevent the spread of communism in Southeast Asia as part of a broader global containment strategy. At the same time, the United States sought to maintain and strengthen its alliance with France and Europe, viewing Paris as a key partner in balancing Soviet influence during the unstable post-war international order. Moreover, providing aid to France allowed the United States to avoid deploying its own troops directly to Indochina, thereby limiting American military casualties and domestic political pressure. In practice, U.S. assistance to France steadily increased in both financial and military terms, accounting for a substantial proportion of the total cost of France's war effort in Indochina. However, this support could not compensate for the strategic and practical limitations of French forces, when confronting an adversary with strong determination and a strategy well suited to the conditions of People's War. The culmination of this failure was the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, which ended on May 7, 1954, with a decisive victory for Vietnamese forces. This defeat not only ended France's dominant role in Indochina, but also compelled the major powers to convene at the Geneva Conference, opening a new and turbulent chapter in the history of Vietnam and the region. Following France's defeat at Dien Bien Phu, the relevant parties were forced to seek a political solution to end the war in Indochina. The Geneva Conference was convened, and the Geneva Accords of 1954 were officially signed, marking a significant turning point in modern Vietnamese history. Under the main provisions of the Accords, Vietnam was temporarily divided into two military regroupment zones along the 17th parallel, following the Ben Hai River, which served as the military demarcation line. The armed forces of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam regrouped in the north, while French Union forces and troops of the state of Vietnam regrouped in the south. This division was explicitly defined as temporary and not as a permanent territorial or political partition. The Accords stipulated that nationwide free elections would be held in 1956 to reunify the country. Participating states also committed to respecting Vietnam's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity, refraining from interference in its internal affairs, and avoiding the establishment of military bases or alliances in Indochina. Nevertheless, President Ho Chi Minh early on warned the Vietnamese people to remain vigilant against the schemes of major powers seeking to exploit this temporary division and transform it into a lasting separation for their own strategic calculations in the Cold War context. The signing of the Geneva Accords in 1954 not only brought the First Indochina War to an end, but also triggered profound political, social, and military transformations in Vietnam. One of the most immediate and visible consequences was a large-scale population migration between the two regions during the regroupment period. According to data from the International Commission for Supervision and Control, approximately 890,000 people migrated from the north to the south, while more than 140,000 people moved from the south to the north. These population movements reflected political polarization, widespread anxiety about the continuation of war, and were significantly influenced by propaganda and mobilization campaigns conducted by multiple actors. Parallel to the migration process, French forces gradually withdrew from Indochina, ending their direct role in Vietnam and transferring power to the State of Vietnam government in the south. The power vacuum left by France was swiftly filled by the United States. In pursuit of its strategy to contain communism in Southeast Asia, Washington expanded economic and military assistance to South Vietnam, introducing large quantities of modern weapons and equipment, and organizing military training along American lines. Within less than 2 years, U.S. aid accounted for approximately 80% of the South Vietnamese government's military budget. This deepening involvement not only altered the balance of power between North and South, but also laid the foundation for the United States to gradually replace France as the decisive external actor in Vietnam's political and military landscape in the subsequent period. In accordance with the spirit of the 1954 Geneva Accords, Vietnam was scheduled to hold nationwide elections in 1956 to achieve reunification through peaceful means. However, the Ngo Dinh Diem government in the south refused to participate in these elections, citing the inability to guarantee free, fair, and transparent conditions under the prevailing political circumstances. This argument was advanced at a time when South Vietnam was increasingly receiving strong financial, military, and political support from the United States, and was simultaneously consolidating internal power. In reality, numerous documents and assessments from the U.S. side indicate that the refusal to hold elections was not solely based on technical concerns regarding electoral conditions. Reports by the Central Intelligence Agency CIA acknowledged that at the time, approximately 80% of Vietnam's population was likely to vote in favor of President Ho Chi Minh if nationwide elections were held. Fully aware of this unfavorable political balance, the Ngo Dinh Diem administration, with U.S. backing, chose to delay and ultimately reject the implementation of the elections altogether. As a result, the most important commitment of the Geneva Accords was violated. The peaceful reunification of the country became impossible, and the path was opened for prolonged confrontation and escalating armed conflict in Vietnam in the years that followed. After the failure to implement nationwide reunification elections as stipulated by the Geneva Accords, the United States gradually promoted the construction of a separate political entity in South Vietnam to serve its strategy of containing communism in Southeast Asia. With comprehensive U.S. support, Ngo Dinh Diem consolidated his power and officially established a separate state south of the 17th parallel, detached from the internationally recognized reunification process. This government relied heavily on U.S. economic and military aid, as well as political guidance, becoming increasingly dependent on Washington in both domestic governance and foreign relations. In the process of consolidating power, the Ngo Dinh Diem government carried out harsh repression against opposition forces and individuals who had participated in or supported the anti-French resistance. Under U.S. influence, the term Viet Minh was gradually replaced with Viet Cong, aiming to strip the resistance forces of their national legitimacy and portray them as purely communist. At the same time, many symbols of the anti-French resistance, including historical sites, memorials, and war cemeteries, were destroyed or removed from public spaces. These policies not only intensified social tensions in the South, but also marked the early signs of a new conflict, the Vietnam War, gradually taking shape and becoming increasingly unavoidable. As the conflict in Vietnam escalated, the parties involved developed sharply divergent interpretations of its nature. For the United States and the Republic of Vietnam government, it was primarily viewed as an ideological war within the framework of global confrontation between communism and the anti-communist world. From this perspective, intervention in Vietnam was deemed necessary to prevent the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, protect the free world, and maintain a U.S.-led strategic order. By contrast, for the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, the war had an entirely different character. They regarded it as a war against foreign aggression, continuing the long-standing tradition of struggle for national independence and reunification after centuries of external domination. In this view, the United States was not a defender of freedom, but a great power that succeeded French colonialism, intervening in Vietnam's internal affairs to impose its political will. Consequently, in the perception of many Vietnamese, the United States was seen as a new foreign aggressor, and the war against the U.S. was placed alongside earlier resistance wars in national history. In modern world history, the conflict in Vietnam is commonly referred to as the Vietnam War, and is regarded as one of the most prominent flashpoints of the Cold War. Many Western scholars characterize it as a proxy war, in which major powers, particularly the United States on one side, and the Soviet Union and China on the other, confronted each other indirectly through a regional battlefield. From this perspective, Vietnam became a space of strategic competition between two opposing blocs within the bipolar post-World War II international order. However, in Vietnamese historical consciousness, the conflict is known as the Resistance War against the United States, emphasizing its nature as a struggle for national liberation, independence, and reunification. This difference in terminology reflects fundamentally different understandings of the war's essence. Moreover, to this day, there remain differing views regarding the starting point of the Vietnam War. Some argue that it began in 1947, when the United States started providing aid to France in Indochina, while others identify 1955, when the U.S. officially deepened its involvement in South Vietnam, as a clearer point of origin. Notably, as early as the beginning of the 1960s, General Charles de Gaulle warned that the United States risked becoming mired in Vietnam in the same way France had earlier, a historically profound prediction regarding the fate of the war. Vietnam War Chronicles. See you in the next installments.